So, Spider-Man, No Way Home. The first of probably quite a few multiverse movies coming out, dealing with this idea of the multiverse and multiple realities. I believe DC has some in the works as well. So, what is so appealing about this idea? Why have so many comic book stories use it? Is it just a convenient way to jam incongruent stories together? Well, frankly, yes, but the multiverse also symbolizes a very powerful psychological principle that allows for very potentially moving stories. Want to know what it is? Well, stick around. So first things first, spoiler alert. If you haven't seen Spider-Man No Way Home, go see it. It's a great movie. It's a lot of fun. And then come back. Then we'll talk about it. So, if you're still here, then that means you're pressing forward. So I'll give you a quick synopsis. Now, this is the third in 3 movies with Tom Holland playing Spider-Man. And in the end of the last movie, his secret identity was revealed. And this movie starts off with all the havoc that is causing in his life. In fact, it's ruining his life and the lives of his friends, most specifically his best friend and his girlfriend MJ. And because of those things, he goes, of course, he does what anybody would do. He goes to Doctor Strange to cast a spell to fix it all, right? I mean, isn't that what everybody would do? Well, as you can imagine, everything goes completely wrong. He tries to back out once he realizes that casting the spell means that everyone forget that he's Spider-Man. In fact, they'll forget who he is, and he'll have to reintroduce himself to them and all of that sort of thing. He doesn't like that. So in the middle of the spell, he's backing out, and he can causes confusion, and the spell goes wrong, as spells have, a bad habit of doing. And what does this do? Well, it opens up this huge rift in the fabric of reality, causing the Spider-Man villains from the previous Spider-Man movies of the 2000s and the later series to show up and start attacking him, complete with the actors who played these characters in these other versions of Spider-Man. Namely, you've got the Lizard, you've got Green Goblin, you've got Electro, you've got Sandman. And all of these characters started running amok. Well, Doctor Strange says, all right, we got to put these guys back. We got to send these people back to where they came from. And they learned that the villains actually are ghosts in a way, because all they remember is everything that happened up until the point which they died. And now they're here. So Spider-Man, Peter Parker, Tom Holland's version, says, oh, wait a minute, if we send them back, they'll just die. And of course, Doctor Strange is like, well, that's their fate, But he doesn't care much for that. He wants to try to redeem them and save them. So he comes up with these dubious explanations to create various ways to save them, coming up with hand-wavy sci-fi fantasy type stuff. That point's not as important as the fact that he is really going through all this effort to try to save them, to remove the powers that made them into the villains that they are. But this goes horribly wrong, and it winds up getting Aunt May killed. So that's like the first really big emotional moment in this movie. It's a gut punch. You might see it coming, you might not, depending on how familiar you are with these sorts of stories. But this causes him to despair, and it causes him to question his compassion, and it starts leading him down a dark path. He starts to get angry, he wants revenge and all that sort of stuff. So he falls into despair. But what do his friends do? Well, they're trying to find him, and his friend uses a magic device to open up a portal. And they see Spider-Man there. And well, okay, there he is. But who walks through the portal then to them as they're calling for him? Well, it's not Tom Holland Spider-Man. It's Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. So then another portal opens up, and Tobey Maguire Spider-Man walks in. So now we've got 3 Spider-Man characters. Spider-Man, Spider-Mans? Spidersmen. Okay, I don't know. Anyway, they come into this world, and they try to help him. They try to get him back on track, help him through his trauma, and help him accomplish his original mission of redeeming the villains and sending them back. But the problem, of course, with this is that ultimately he has to make the sacrifice. That means the original spell that he wished for has to come true. And the movie ends then with him recognizing that he's going to have to reintroduce himself to all of these people again. So it kind of reboots the story in a way. And this is, where the story ends. So my take on this movie, before we get into the psychological stuff, I had a lot of fun with it. I really feel like this premise could have been just a cheap gimmick. Luckily, they decided to actually tell a story with it that involves a character arc and him learning how to, get back on track after taking a major hit. Is that an especially profound character arc? No, not really. I mean, but it's got heart. I mean, it's not Shakespeare, right? It's a Marvel. Who cares? It's fun. And it does have a lot of heart with it. And it's very well acted. It's got a lot of funny moments. So, I mean, honestly, the premise for this is utterly bonkers. But they find a way to tell the story, to get this crazy premise going, but take it seriously enough to allow us to follow through Tom Holland's character's arc. Peter Parker, learning to find his compassion again, learning to find his mission, and still be the hero, still be Spider-Man, and all that sort of thing, even though he felt like he wasn't going to be able to do it anymore. They do this with, at the same time, kind of poking fun, good-natured fun at the previous movies, but also showing us that, hey, those characters were really good takes on Spider-Man too. They actually were pretty decent. And giving them a heart and allowing the characters to interact, the Spider-Man characters especially interacting with each other, is a major heart and soul of this film. And that's really how this connects to the idea of this multiverse business. In this particular version, or in this particular Spider-Man story, they do make the multiverse idea work pretty well. But how do you think they did it? How did they make it work without it just being a cheap gimmick? And in general, why is this idea so popular and so common in comic book stories? Well, it has to do with the fact that we're dealing with fantasy. And in fact, horror, fantasy, and sci-fi are all probably the most psychological of the storytelling genres that are out there. And the reason why they are is because since you're dealing with speculative fiction, whether it be horror elements or science fiction elements or just pure fantasy elements, it means that the storytelling is now free of the constraints of what we know about physics and reality and all that sort of thing. It can be more direct and precise in its symbolism as a result. And an added bonus is that it also has what we call minimal counterintuitiveness. In other words, you can make things memorable by having them just slightly different from reality. He's a teenager, he's a high school student, and he has Spider-Man powers. So it connects you to something you're familiar with, but then it tells you something off the wall, and it's a very powerful way of achieving resonance in a story. Now, fantasy's got all kinds of stuff like that. Fantasy, sci-fi, horror, they all do that. Now, because you are unfettered by the constraints of reality, that means that when you're telling a story, the symbolism that you're using can be much more precise and much more accurate to the emotional truth that you're trying to convey. So, in a sense, fantastical storytelling is actually more realistic than so-called realistic storytelling, because of the fact that you can really drill down and hit the symbolism in as precise a manner as you can. Now, the drawback is, because, again, of the same strength, because you're unfettered by the constraints of reality, you can tell wildly ridiculous stories that don't have much emotional resonance or meaning to them either, because they just can go flying off the rails and make no sense. And that's a common problem with fantastical storytelling, if it's not disciplined the way this story is. And most of the Marvel movies so far, and the TV shows as well, the writers seem to know this. They know what they're doing. I think. I do believe they could probably take more risks than they do, but you know, that's probably easy for me to say because I don't have millions of dollars on the line. But aside from all of that, it does strike me that they do understand this strength of fantastical storytelling, and they use it. So then, what is the multiverse idea really about? In this case, and in many cases when you're dealing with multiverse-type stories, it's a way to symbolize an exploration of alternative versions of yourself. Sort of like looking into who I could have been, but am not. What might have happened, but didn't. And it's sort of like a split personality, but viewed from a higher elevation. They have explored this already in the Loki TV series. In that series, and if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert for that too. But in that series, Loki encounters this multiverse stuff and runs into multiple Lokis. Some of them are animals even. But the most beautiful element of that story is that he meets a female version of himself and then falls in love with that character. And through that, now that by itself would not make for a very good story. It's what they do with it that makes it better. It's that this allows him to heal from traumas that he experienced before. And experiencing self-doubt and self-hatred and all that sort of thing, he learns to fall in love with himself again. But if you'll notice, this is fantastical storytelling. And so you're allowed to do that on a literal level. Like you really have an alternative version of you that you literally fall in love with. Now, they also play it for laughs, too. But the writers of Marvel have figured out a way to tell fantastical stories while simultaneously poking a little bit of fun at how ridiculous it all is, and at the same time still yet taking it seriously. They've nailed that tone, which is probably why they're so successful. All right, so what are some other things that can be done with this idea? Quite a bit. But the core of the multiverse idea is that it is, in a sense, a symbol of the imagination itself, actually. Okay, because we as humans have the ability to imagine things vividly as they are not. In fact, this capacity that we have is so powerful, it's actually can be a drawback as well. It's a core feature of the human condition that we can imagine things other than how they actually are. It's a nearly magical ability, if you will, but it leaves its mark on us. Now, why do I say that? It's because this ability to conjure up vivid alternatives can lead us to despair, to fragmentation. I should have done this, I could have done that, I might have been this. If we didn't have the ability to imagine that stuff, it wouldn't bother us at all. But of course we do. So that means that our very capacity for imagination, as powerful as it is, and it's very convincing and very powerful, it can lead us to fragmentation. It can lead us to dissociation. You see this in trauma all the time. And in fact, whether it was done consciously or not, you should notice that the two other Spider-Men don't show up until May dies, and he's hit with the hardest trauma of his life, at least in this iteration. He experiences a split as a result of the trauma, which is displayed vividly, as it would in a dream. In a dream, it would be just like this. You would see alternative versions of yourself if the split is deep. And the result doesn't resolve itself until he learns to work with these other Spider-Men. And that leads to a lot of really fun but also heartfelt conversations between these other characters, and they discuss their life experiences. And there's a great moment where they both bring up the quote, "With great power comes great responsibility." We didn't get that exact quote in the Tom Holland version of this, but the other two, they did. And so now he gets it, but it comes from Aunt May instead. So anyway, so he doesn't heal until he learns to work with these others, and he then even achieves redemption for the villains. He manages to cure them and send them back, hopefully to live happy lives now that they aren't villainized by their magic powers. That's another a whole other concept in the Spider-Man movies that we could do another video on, really. But I wanted to focus on the multiverse idea here. I have a feeling we're going to see this multiverse business again, because as far as I know, there's a DC version of this coming up, and I'm looking forward to that. Hashtag restore the Snyderverse. Again, I'll keep saying it. But tell me what you guys think, and until next time, thanks for watching.